The ancient Greeks, whether they told us stories of Odysseus' adventures or the flaws of kings giving into their passions, or the tales of Olympians winning awards, excellence is what it's all about. The ultimate concern is about the kind of person you are, the excellence that you practice, the excellence that made your being. The primary concerns were about who you are. Aristotle's ethics realized that human beings possess by nature reason and passions, and that if you observe people in action, they reveal that too often a person can give in to passions and impulses without reason. And when we do, our life can go to extremes. And so we seek the balance, the path between extremes, the path that moderates. And when Aristotle saw this path of moderation, he took note of the virtues that marked the lives of the people who had found the golden mean. He noted how they practiced, what they practiced, and how that resulted in a way of life. That they had become the kind of student, professional, friend, citizen, spouse, father, the kind of man you are, one in which reason, moderated passions, so that you would seek what benefits all, rather than just yourself or the few closest to you. We are what we repeatedly do. Moral excellence, doing the right and just thing, is not an action, but a habit, something you do over and over again in quest for the good life. Is Immanuel Kant's world so very different from the world of Aristotle's ethics? It's not only a matter of millennium, two to be exact, but it's also an orientation toward the world and oneself. Aristotle lived in a world where, while they were conceiving political ideas like a democracy, a sense of order, a sense of balance pervaded their concerns. And so they considered democracies a bit too haphazard, too susceptible to the passions of individuals to be a trustworthy form of government. They relied instead upon the notion of a virtuous king, one who was calling the shots because he understands the balance between passions, the need for reason. And if you couldn't have a king, at best, then maybe you could have an aristocracy, a group of people who were virtuous themselves. Immanuel Kant lives in a very different world. It was an age of revolutions, French, American, and by the 1840s, some 40 years after his death, Germany and Italy, revolutions spread across continents, Europe, South America. And at the heart of those revolutions was this notion that the individual had reason, and that reason could help him or her exercise a moral imagination an ability to see what ethics would look like between citizens, forming societies that sought the right, the good, and the just. And so for them, particularly Immanuel Kant, raised the question, can you imagine a community where? And then you would imagine. They call him a deontologist because he seems to be focused on duty and laws, but he's not as rigid as people have made him out to be. His social ethics really grows out of this quote: two things fill the mind with ever new and increasing wonder and awe: the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. Like a good Enlightenment thinker, he saw within nature a series of laws. You know this from the study of science, looking at people like Isaac Newton discovering the laws of physics. And so Kant took that same notion of natural laws that human beings could perceive by their reason and imagination, and he turned it inward and said, we can imagine what our moral duty is, what our laws are for how we should be, what is good, what is right, and what is just. And you can see from Martin Farrell that he could imagine even that disobeying a law could be our moral duty, because we realized in our reason and imagination that that law was not something that all people could embrace, or perhaps it had been so distorted that it began to serve ends other than human benefit. We know that spirit alive in people like Martin Luther King Jr., who says that we have a moral duty to disobey unjust laws, because, like Kant, you would realize that those laws could not apply to all people in all places, that you wouldn't want everyone doing that. You wouldn't want everyone acting with prejudice and discrimination and creating laws that would deny people an opportunity to flourish. And so you see, in Kant's categorical imperative, he's really asking you to imagine that before you act, you ask yourself, what if everyone acted like this? And also ask yourself, is my action treating people as a means to satisfy some end in me? Those are his two principles. And they don't seem to me to be principles that are legalistic and constricting, but rather they are imaginative. And that's Kant's great contribution, that he stirred our moral imaginations, that he prompted us to ask that question. Imagine a community that, and your job was to imagine, what would it be like? And so moral duty is a matter of freedom. I'd like you to stop and think for a second. In what ways is PrEP a conscient community? In what ways does PrEP compromise a conscient ethics? Because it is my duty to do what is right. It is that simple. The utilitarians, defined much by the right of the pursuit of happiness, used reason to observe what constituted human happiness. Now, their understanding of happiness differed remarkably from Aristotle's understanding of happiness. Utilitarians were concerned with locating the consequences or outcomes that created the greatest amount of happiness. Mill observed that the pursuit of happiness occurs in terms of increasing pleasure and avoiding pain. Now, Mill's kind of utilitarian recognizes that there are all kinds of happiness: intellectual, aesthetic, social, economic, many different kinds of pleasures and pain. Some are more valuable than others. Now, there are two kinds of utilitarians. There's the act-utilitarian, who focuses on situations one at a time and seeks the action that produces the greatest amount of happiness. They recognize that different situations will yield different benefits. A rule utilitarian observes the experience of human beings, especially their social experiences, and notices that there are particular kinds of actions that consistently yield greater happiness. And so they make those certain actions into rules, like honesty is the best policy. And human beings ought to have the ability to exercise their freedom of thought, religion, speech. Now, utilitarians, as a moral philosophy, when it's applied to real life, yields some complex moral challenges, some situations that, when they follow their calculus, lead to some problems. And that calculus is that you take the amount of good in a situation, you subtract from it the amount of evil in that situation, you add to it the greater number of people who would benefit, and that tells you what action would be, if that action would be most useful, would be worth pursuing. The difficulty is that often the happiness of the few, the happiness of those who are considered other than the majority, the minority, is frequently sacrificed. The happiness of the few are sacrificed for the benefit of the many. And that may not be supportive of the utilitarian principles of equality and liberty. Jean-Jacques Rousseau did not live to see the French Revolution, yet his ideas influenced the age of revolutions that would extend into the 20th century. He believed that the purpose of educational systems was to prepare the whole person for citizenship. Unlike Hobbes, who, like the Puritan tradition, asserted that human beings are by nature wicked, Rousseau captured the Enlightenment confidence in the human potential for goodness and for the creation of good societies. Societies in which people would agree among themselves over how they will organize, how they will establish rules and policies, and what the individual's responsibility would be and the community's responsibility would be. They would enter into a social contract. Philosophers like Rawls are not naive. They saw utilitarianism, the human inclination to pursue self-interest, as one was pursuing happiness. Rawls, like Rousseau, saw that the relationship between people and elected officials, governments, are a relationship of commitment and responsibility. But at the heart of them, all those commitments were focused on realizing the idea of equality, opportunity, the pursuit of happiness of each and every citizen. In a sense, Rawls' social contract commits to leaving no one behind. There is no minority. There is no other. There is no few to be neglected. For Rawls, there are three conditions that create a social policies, laws, a social order that guarantees, or at least tries to realize, justice. Michael Walzer, who we learned about earlier, really tries to capture much of what John Rawls is after when Walzer tries to establish some of the fundamentals of, or the basic provisions of social justice in a society. He sees that people need certain essentials in order to be able to participate in society, in order to be able to pursue the happiness that's theirs. And so he encourages the United States, our leaders in our legal system, that when they proceed to try to develop a law or a policy, that they would try as best as they can to assume not the perspective of self-interest, but the veil of ignorance, where they set aside their self-interest, where they set aside any prejudices or biases they may have, and they seek after what is fair for everyone in that society. And they feel and he feels that the best way to do that, like Rawls, is to seek what Rawls called a maximum solution. That is, whenever you're going to sit down and make a law or policy, that you ask yourself, what will be the impact of that policy or law on those in our society who are least advantaged or most disadvantaged? Your answer to that will help you to assure liberty, opportunity, and the pursuit of happiness. Perhaps this musical video, using a familiar symbol, might help you to imagine what a social contract, social ethics is all about.
I need a theory of justice, something ambitious for everyone's sake, a genuine intellectual earthquake. I'll think of a theory of justice, a blueprint for each liberal democracy that balances freedom with equality. I'll write a theory of justice, a work that no rational man could refute, to render the rest of philosophy moot.
Now we will consider different voices in social ethics. Three moral theologies, visions of social ethics grounded in personal and communal religious experiences. What are their central visions? Where do those visions come from? What are the critical concepts of their moral theologies? And if you were to do social ethics the way that they do social ethics, what would you be doing?